Okay, so previous video talked about the problem of harm principle, Mill's moral philosophy, and its basics, and its applicability on to political philosophy. But now let's think about the problem of free speech that we can find in on liberty. So what does Mill say about freedom of speech? Why is it important for him? And in what cases can we limit it based on the harm principle? So to begin with, how does Mill defend free speech? So Mill takes a quite strong stance, and he writes a lot about the freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and he finds it quite essential to liberty. Why is this so? So for Mill, the liberative capabilities are essential to knowledge. So, it's important to be able to deliberate and to discuss different things in order to come to a justified true belief. What does this mean? So we need to test out different opportunities. We need to discuss different opportunities. We need to, defend them rationally in order to actually justify our beliefs, to come to a situation when we don't just hold beliefs, but we actually have knowledge about life, knowledge about what we want, so on and so forth. So Mill is saying, we want as diverse of a society. We want a society where as many things can be discussed so that we can get as much different opinions, we can defend and develop our things, and we can rationally and critically think about them. Because remember, as we talked in the previous part, for Mill, it's not okay to just imitate. We want to actually think about things for ourselves, we want to actually come to conclusions on our own. And this is especially important when it comes to life experiments. So for Mill, it's part of, as we talked earlier, that humans are progressive beings and we need to test out different things and so on. And this comes to our life. And in this sense, free speech is important as well, because we want to discuss different options we have in life. We want to see them, we want to rationally discuss and choose our way of living. This is only possible if we can see how others live their life, if we can discuss it in public. So the second thing Mill says is then that free speech, sorry about that, is important for four actually different things. So firstly, he says that, opinions we think are false might turn out to be true. So if something turns out, that was actually true and we thought it was false and we censored it because of it, this is an obvious harm. Because in that case, we were missing out on the truth. And this is something that Mill is just not ready to defend, because as we mentioned earlier, truth for him is essential for us to test out different life experiments, to think about how to live our life. Secondly, even if an opinion might not turn out to be true, it might contain part of the truth. So for example, different conspiracy theories, right, might not capture the reality of the whole situation, but they might be right about certain things, right? And this is why for Mill, we shouldn't censor free speech, because we might lose parts of the truth that we can only get if we can discover and compare different situations, can discuss different ideas. Only then are we able to see what parts of truth are actually out there in different situations, in different scenarios. Thirdly, and this one is, a situation where Mill really shows why, even in cases when false opinions are true, are essential here, is because it prevents true beliefs from becoming dogma. So what Mill says is that, dogma is basically something when we don't think about critically, is an unjustified belief that we hold. And this is something that Mill does not want, right? So he says that when something becomes dogma, it's useless. And this is what unchallenged opinions are. Unchallenged opinions are just dogmas because no one thinks about them critically, no one challenges them, they're just out there and that's it. And we follow them like apes and we imitate them rather than critically encouraging them or critically rejecting them. So, for him, false beliefs are actually the ones that prevent true beliefs from becoming dogma, because at the end of the day, they are able to give us a challenge. And when we have a challenge, you need to either defend true beliefs, and you need to build up them, you need to think about them critically, not just follow them as a dogma. And this is why for Mill, for all those three different reasons, freedom of speech is very important, because it may, false opinion might turn out to be true, it might contain part of the truth, and, it prevents true beliefs from becoming dogma. And this altogether is why we shouldn't censor speech, right? So he's saying we should not interfere with it. In those cases, we think there are more benefits than harms. And in particular, and especially importantly, he's saying that just because something is offensive, it cannot and it should not be sanctioned. So offensive speech for Mill is not good enough for us to something to be sanctioned. Okay, so, but Mill is not always against regulating free speech. So no, he has a strong case for why in 95% of cases, this is not something we should do. But he also says that there are cases we might legitimately want to restrict freedom of speech. And he says that this is in cases where we can show that the harm to other people actually materializes. So again, when we are talking about harm here, we think about first instance perceptible damage being done to other persons. So for Mill, he says that when it comes to speech, context is what matters. So in majority of cases, context does not justify, it does not lead to a first instance, perceptible damage. But in some cases it does. And when it does, then it's okay to limit freedom of speech as well. So what does Mill say? Mill says, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. An opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor or that private property is robbery ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer or when handed out among the same mob in the form of a placard. Okay, so basically he's saying, it's okay to write about certain things in a newspaper, but it's not okay to spread those same things when someone wants to do something about them and they're ready to get violent and dangerous. So for example, if we use a more contemporary example, when we talk about COVID and, compulsory vaccinations and things like that, he says that it's perfectly okay to publish in a newspaper that, compulsory vaccinations are limitations of people's freedom, that they are unjustified and so on. But it's not okay to distribute the same message in front of a house of a doctor who the mob just wants to lynch, right? So that is not okay for me. So we dealt with Mill's interpretation and how, a more strict interpretations of Mill and freedom of speech actually work like. So we have a number of things, right? So firstly, in 95% of cases, for Mill, freedom of speech should not be violated. In some cases, there might be some justifications, but those are quite rare. And in those cases, we need to always revert to the harm principle. So we need to consider whether limiting it is actually because there is some harm being done to other person. And secondly, whether overall utility of this limitation is making it worth it, or whether limitation might be even more harmful. So what we will discuss now in the next section is things that are more Millian, so still building on Mill's work, but interpreting and taking it in a different direction. So a bit stricter interpretations when it comes to freedom of speech, where speech is not something that should not be violated in most cases, but where they try to show that in significant number of cases, speech can be subjected to societal and legal punishments. So to begin with, let's start with hate speech. So, when arguing that hate speech should be limited, we need to begin with examining the value of deliberative values, right? So why are they important for Mill? So, Mill, contrary to classical utilitarianisms, doesn't say that all pleasures are of equal value. On the contrary, he has an ordered systems of pleasures, right? So he says that some pleasures are more important than others, and deliberation and deliberative values are quite high on that ladder. So, very close, if we look on a hierarchy, they're quite close to the top as, values. And because they're so important, because, they allow us to discover different ways of living, to test out different life experiments, as we discussed a bit earlier. This is why they're important, and this is why we should, really think what are the consequences on deliberative values when examining certain actions and certain consequences of those actions for individuals. And, what Brink is arguing in his essay, he essentially argues that hate speech devaluates deliberative values And because the liberative values are so important to our overall exercise of liberty, because they are essential to us testing out life experiments, because they are essential for us to avoid ape-like imitation, this is why we need to protect those same values from being lost in the future. And this is why we can limit hate speech, right? So to begin at the beginning, at some point, Mill says that one cannot sell oneself into slavery, because by that you would give up all of your liberty. So what Brink takes from this is that Mill is willing to sanction some things that are not, directly connected with Hunt principle, if you show that liberty overall might be harmed in the future if those things are not limited. Slavery being one example, and Brink says that the same applies to hate speech. Why? Because the liberative values are so high up on Mill's hierarchy, because they are so important to the exercise of liberty. This is why hate speech must be limited in order to preserve the power of the liberative values, in order to not see their deterioration in the future. So in what way does Brink think that the hate speech devaluates liberty and the liberative values? Three ways. Firstly, it degrades the conversation by invoking a visceral argument and producing a visceral response. So what Brink says is that it avoids actual rational explanations and actual rational arguments, because it starts an emotional argumentation and produces an emotional response, right? Because hate speech is essentially, using different derogatory words that invoke someone else's group identity. So for example, racial slurs are examples of that, or slurs based on someone's gender identity and so on. So all of those things are, invoking a visceral argument and producing a visceral response rather than creating a grounds for a rational debate. So you cannot have a rational discussion, you cannot test out different things, you cannot deliberate on them, and this is why they actually degrade the conversation. Secondly, Brink says, hate speech silences minority views. Why? Because, minorities, when you try to use negative prejudices against their group identity, are less likely to speak up when you have those situations. Also empirically confirmed, right? Which essentially means that you have less discussion, less equal footing, because you cannot engage with that when someone calls you a racial slur, for example, right? You're less likely to engage, you're less likely to have a debate, thus the liberative values are deteriorated. Lastly, emotionality results in an unfair hearing for the targets. So what brings us is that when audience hears hate speech, this means that they are less likely to give due credit to the member of the minority or the target of the hate speech. In that case, we again cannot have a rational discussion. There is no testing of different ways of life and things like that, but we only have an unfair hearing of one group trying to overpower the other group by invoking hate speech. And for all of those three reasons, for Brink, it's justified to limit hate speech, because in that way, we actually preserve the liberative values. And because the liberative values are so high up on the ladder of Mill's system of pleasures, they are so important to liberty that we can apply the same principle as Mill applies it when it comes to selling oneself into slavery. So Brink says, this is why hate speech can be limited and should be limited even by social and legal punishments. Okay, so, we cleared the hate speech, but, what about some, offensive speech? How about that? Okay, so when it comes to, a different type of speech, so when it comes to offensive speech, we need to look at different principles, right? And here we'll be talking about Feinberg's works. So, is there a situation, Feinberg asks, when, we can justifiably interfere with, offensive speech? Are there actions that are as offensive that you may sanction them, even though there is no harm there? So, his answer is, well, to a degree, yes, but not really, right? Because he says, and his conclusion is, and we'll return to that, that, there are natural punishments connected with, offensive actions, and that's okay. And he says that that's justified, but that there is less grounds actually for, supporting social and, legal punishments. He says that maybe in some cases of really dire offenses, that might be so, but not really much of a philosophical justification and be given to strict legal punishments just because someone's offended. So, when discussing offensive speech, Feinberg says that a number of criteria are important. So he says, the first thing we need to consider is seriousness of the offense. So what is the magnitude of the offense, whether we could have avoided the offense, whether, the other party consented to the offense. All of those things talk about the seriousness of the offense. And then secondly, it's important to look at the reasonableness of offending conduct. So how important was it to the actor? Does it have any social utility? So for example, does it increase free expression? Are there any non-offensive alternatives? What is the extent to the maliciousness of the action? So was it intentional or not? So things like that, all of those things are important to consider when it comes to offense. So, while other millions would say that this is not ever grounds for a proper punishment, Feinberg asks, what about cases that are usually punished and they produce no harm to others? For example, necrophilia, right? So necrophilia is a non-offensive act that does not hurt any other person. There is no first instance perceptible damage, right? If we use Riley's definition. But in many cases, it's illegal in most countries, right? We certainly have social stigma attached to it. There are lots of different things, that we consider that are wrong with those actions. And Feinberg basically says, and there are quite good justifications for that, right? Because this is a big magnitude of an action. This might be avoidable or might be not, it does not have much social utility. There are non-offensive alternatives, perhaps. There is intentional action and so on. So he's saying, there are quite good grounds to say why certainly natural punishments are okay in those cases. So there are grounds for us to feel upset by those actions. There are grounds for us to have an emotional response to it. And then he says also that maybe in some cases, such as, really dire offenses like necrophilia, you can also have situations when might be like that social punishments are okay. So it might be okay to stigmatize people. It might be okay to say, this is not okay, you shouldn't be doing that. But, Feinberg does say quite explicitly at the end that offensive speech cannot be legally punished, at least not in most cases, right? So apart from very few exceptions, he said there is no convincing reasons why for us to legally punish offensive speech. And, as we will discuss later on, this will be important because he's quite alone here. So he's saying that offensive speech can never be punished. And, if we discuss whether today what we are doing and what we want to limit are offensive speeches, and whether social and natural punishments being handed out today, or even legal punishment being handed out today, this is all important. So, keep the Feinberg principle in mind for later on. Cool. That's it for now, and see you later.